Is it too early for this? Nah.
And all I've got to offer is sensitivity, intelligence, and charm.
I really like scary movies. Like, a whole gosh darn lot. From classic slashers like Halloween, to more modern flicks like Ari Aster's catalog, to foreign films like Let the Right One In or The Curse. I know that The Curse is actually the subtitle of that movie, but I'm gonna save everyone the headache and not try to say that word. I think it's Noroi. But there's a subgenre of horror that's always held a very special place in my heart, since I first discovered it at the very impressionable age of 5 years old with Tim Burton's Beetlejuice. And if you've read the title of this video, you already know what it is. Horror comedy is exactly what it sounds like. A film genre that combines elements of horror and comedy. It's typically categorized by 3 types: black comedy, parody, and spoof. An example of black comedy being Diablo Cody's Jennifer's Body, an example of parody being Taika Waititi's What We Do in the Shadows, and an example of spoof being the Scary Movie franchise. Horror comedy is a pretty large subgenre which encompasses a lot of stuff, which is only part of what makes its history so fascinating. The scares and laughs have been closely associated for as long as stories have been told. Why do you tell scary stories? Why do you go to a haunted attraction? At least in my experience, it usually comes down to getting the laugh after the scare. Getting scared when there's no real threat is, a lot of the time, funny. So let's take a closer look at how we got here. Let's take a look at the history of horror comedy. The first great horror comedy story is often attributed to Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820. Set around Halloween and filled with the mischief that comes with the season. Other horror comedy authors of the 19th century include the oftentimes tongue-in-cheek Edgar Allan Poe, Oscar Wilde with his Portrait of Dorian Gray, and many other less famous individuals who published parodies of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula. In fact, some would argue that the preferred style of horror literature in the 19th century was black comedy. Eventually, this did what literature tends to do and turned into plays. Plays like The Bat, The Cat and the Canary, and The Gorilla. Basically turning the stage into a silly haunted house filled with silly haunted monsters. Honestly, I wish I would have been there to see some of these plays in person because they seem wild. The Gorilla is literally about a gorilla that escapes from the zoo and haunts a investor who is holed up in a Long Island mansion. You absolutely love to see it. Many of these plays ended up getting silent film adaptations as we rolled into the early 20th century, including The Gorilla in 1927 and The Canary in the same year, which I'm pretty sure The Canary is actually a very famous piece of lost media, if you guys want to look more into that. Which gives us a nice little segue into this is the era of Abbott and Costello, good, clean American fun, and racism. These horror comedies are marked by their monsters that don't really pose any threat and really don't exhibit any actual violence. Heavy hitters during this era were Laurel and Hardy, with films like Live Ghost in 1932 and A Haunting We Will Go in 1942. They were joined, of course, by Abbott and Costello, with the aptly named Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948, and Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy in 1955. This was slapstick comedy with a dash of the spooks. And the kings of slapstick, the Three Stooges, got in on the action as well, with short films like 1943's Spooks. The horror comedies of this era were 3 parts comedy, 1 part horror. More about the laughs than the scares, which makes sense when you consider that the world was wedged between 2 massive wars. People were looking for a form of escapism, although I'd argue that straight horror is also a form of escapism, but that's a video for another time. Maybe spooky month. A lot of these films find themselves pretty firmly in the spoof category. Then we all collectively lost our goddamn minds. 60s and 70s were trippy, man. Just a little boomer humor there for you. Things in general got really weird, and horror comedy was no exception. This is the era of the cult classic. We have Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and Please Don't Eat My Mother, and of course, the cult classic of cult classics, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. But what's interesting is that while this weird, frankly kinky stuff was happening on one side of horror comedy, the other side was seeing the rise of the horror sitcom. Things like The Monsters, The Addams Family, Scooby-Doo, shows that put a twist on the classic sitcoms of the 50s, shows about weirdos who love each other, maintaining the wholesomeness of the 30s through the 50s, but with just a little bit of the anarchy that tinged the era. Both sides found a lot of their humor in taking jabs at established cliches. Dr. Frankenfurter versus Dr. Frankenstein. Becoming more, let's say, 1.5 parts horror, 2.5 parts comedy. This self-referential style of horror comedy really started to take off, and became the standard for years to come. So, the 80s were a lot. We saw a lot of cute, marketable monsters. Things like Gremlins, Critters, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters. The comedy was in that the danger was adorable. We also saw a lot of humor poking fun at things like vampires, werewolves, poltergeists, and mad scientists. Classic universal monster archetypes. Things like Fright Night in 1985, An American Werewolf in London in 1981, Beetlejuice in 1988, or Reanimator in 1985. Side note, I did a Beetlejuice video like a long time ago, and I've been thinking about redoing it. Might take another stab during Spooky Month. Let me know if you guys would like to see that. Again, these films were taking jabs at conventional horror tropes, but this time stepping up the actual scare factor quite a bit. Speaking of goofing on old tropes, let's talk about the 80s crown prince of horror comedy, most well known for goofing on himself, Sam Raimi and his Evil Dead franchise. The Evil Dead was a low-budget, cabin-in-the-woods horror movie directed by Sam Raimi in 1981. It was played completely straight, if a bit camp. And honestly, there are parts of that original movie that I find really unsettling and kind of icky, in like the good horror way. Well, most of it. There's one scene that's just generally bad. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. The movie's follow-up, 1987's The Evil Dead 2, could almost be called a spoof of the first movie. It's a retelling of the story of The Evil Dead, but this time with claymation and Bruce Campbell spit-in one-liners. The third installment, Army of Darkness, is something we could definitely talk about for a long time. But given the context of this video, it's kind of hard to categorize. The Evil Dead 2 takes self-referential humor to a whole new level, quite literally goofing on the very cliches that the first movie helped to establish. And going into the 90s, the line between parody and straight horror would only become more blurred. The parody and the subject becoming one and the same, and making sure the audience knew it. Horror comedy of the 90s and early 2000s can really be split into two categories: spoofs and parodies. If we're being honest with ourselves, schlock and good movies. The spoofs became so unoriginal at times, they ended up spoofing the parodies. Okay, we all know I'm talking about the Scary Movie franchise, right? By good stuff, we're talking Wes Craven's Scream, an absolute banger of a movie. A straight slasher movie that is itself a parody of slasher movies. Or if you're looking for something more on the comedy side of things, Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead. A zombie movie parody that pokes fun at undead cliches while still keeping you on edge and subverting expectations. Or Trick or Treat, an anthology horror comedy that pokes fun at various different types of scary stories. These movies knew and know that the audience knew what the conventions are. They didn't have to spell out what the reference was, aside from the rules seen in Scream, but that's done so masterfully well that we'll give it a pass. They inhabit the same space they're making fun of. Honestly, with the exception of some cheap spoofs, etc., it could be argued that we were and are in a golden age of horror comedy. Also, if you're looking for something more straight goofy but still good, I highly recommend Psycho Gorman, which is on Shudder, or Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon, which I think you can watch all of that on YouTube. And that's just in the US and UK. Okay, I absolutely have to talk about a couple of my favorite foreign horror comedy movies before I end this video, because it's truly some of the best stuff. Starting in Finland, we have 2010's Rare Exports, A Christmas Tale. This is an evil Santa movie, but not in the way you'd expect. It's a whole lot of fun with a real tender side as well. Moving to Japan, we have one of my absolute faves, 1977's House, or Hausu. This movie is ridiculous. It's a haunted house movie with the trippiest editing you've ever seen. Just an absolute blast if you really love campy horror. Finally, let's stop by Korea and Bong Joon-ho's 2006 creature feature, The Host. This is a movie about a monster created by chemical dumping and a pandemic. Timely. It definitely has some very somber moments, paired with some really funny ones as well. But let's be real, we all already knew that Bong Joon-ho kicks ass. Laughs and screams have always seemed to tickle the same part of the brain. And like I said at the top, the tradition of pairing the two together has been a thing since we've been telling stories. And it seems that these days, these stories are really hitting their stride, blending these two distinct genres into something that's not new, but still manages to subvert expectations. Hey guys! I hope you liked the video. If you did, why not give it some good old engagement? A like? A share? A comment? If you haven't already, you can subscribe. You can even help support what I do here by becoming a patron or buying some merch. The links to both of those things are in the link tree down in the description. Down in the description. I can't say that today for some reason. It's in the description. There's a link tree. You'll see it. If you didn't like the video, may I recommend calling your local representative to express your concerns. Bye! Just an absolute blast if you really love